authorship. So that's the uncomfortable topic that I'm going to talk about. Because authorship is important. It's how we measure our success. It's how our performance gets evaluated. And, I mean, no matter how much we talk about it, there's always going to be gray areas. But in addition to that, there's guidance. And the guidance that we most commonly use is the ICMJE, which is an international consortium of medical journal editors. So the current, and you can find these ICMJE recommendations on their website. 4 criteria are required for someone to be considered an author. Scholarship, drafting or revising, approval, and accountability. So I would say the first one, substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. That's, the crucial one. Second, drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. And final approval of the version, and agreeing to be accountable for all aspects of the work, in ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. So if we go back to the first one, substantial contributions, there you already have some gray area. You need to determine what means substantial contributions. So it's important to remember that all authors should meet all 4 criteria, and everyone who meets all 4 criteria should be included as an author. Those who don't meet all 4 criteria should be acknowledged if they made other contributions to the paper. The last paragraph, that's important. These criteria are not intended for use as a means to disqualify colleagues, because somebody could do a study, write the paper, not give the paper to review to one of the people who should have been a co-author. So, he didn't meet criteria number 2. No, you can't do that. So the important thing is to make sure that everyone who deserves credit is an author, and that there's no one in the list of authors who's not deserving. So these are some conditions that don't necessarily qualify you as an author. Just because you conducted a study and somebody's your supervisor, that doesn't mean that the supervisor made enough of a contribution to be included in the list of authors. Being the PI of the grant that funded the work, so the mere fact that you contributed money doesn't mean that you contributed intellectual content. Actually, I have an example quite recently, working with a colleague who's super smart. He probably has 25 to 30 IQ points on me, and he's super stellar. And I agreed to contribute some money to do something specific that we want to do in his lab, which is to develop a rat model of cochlear implantation. And he kind of assumed that because I was contributing that money, that I would be a co-author. And I told him, no. I hope to provide enough intellectual content that I will be worthy of being a co-author, but you shouldn't automatically consider me a co-author because of that. Data collection does not, in and of itself, justify authorship. Again, this is a gray area. That there may be situations where data collection is so difficult and complicated and requires such specialized knowledge and training that becomes a major contribution. There are other situations where you can easily train a person with brief instructions on how to acquire the data, and then acquiring the data in and of itself is not part of being an author. Same thing about data analysis, or even providing some writing or editorial assistance. In the course of our work, we frequently edit little things for colleagues. That is not enough to make us authors, clearly. being a supervisor for the whole research group. None of these things in and of themselves make you an author, unless you make substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. Substantial contributions in red being the operative part of this. So who's the lead author? The lead author assumes overall responsibility for the manuscript and often serves as the administrative person who's in charge of actually sending the paper to the journal, collecting all the signatures, and so on. The lead author has to provide a significant contribution to the research effort and is not necessarily the PI or the project leader. The lead author is responsible for a number of things, including authorship, deciding who's an author and who's not, and in what position each person should be. Approval, so providing the lead author is responsible for providing a draft of the manuscript to each individual and obtaining their agreement and consent to be co-authors. And finally, the lead author is the point person who's responsible for the integrity of the work and for guaranteeing that reasonable care and effort has been taken to make sure that all the data are complete, accurate, and fairly interpreted. Co-authors. All co-authors must be responsible for authorship. They must acknowledge that they meet authorship criteria according to the criteria we talked about. They have to consent to the lead author that they have reviewed and approved the manuscript, and they are responsible for the content of all appropriate portions of the manuscript. Of course, an individual retains the right to refuse co-authorship if he or she chooses. So you might think that you didn't have time, you needed to submit because you needed something for to be submitted for your grant proposal, and you didn't have time to contact this person who was in Costa Rica on vacation. Well, it may be a nice thing to do, but somebody has the right to decline to be a co-author. So you cannot add someone without their consent. So there are different examples of unacceptable authorship, and all of these happen every day. Once I had a colleague, he's a super clinician, in the chief audiologist in our cochlear implant center. He told me that he received a phone call from someone in a cochlear implant company offering him to be the first author of a manuscript that they were writing, which sounded kind of strange to him. So I guess what this company was trying to do was to obtain the legitimacy of a well-known clinician at a top respected university to support whatever they wanted to say. This sounded strange to him, so he asked me what he should do, and I said, you don't need this, it doesn't make any sense, just say no. That would be an example of guest, gift, or ghost authorship. So, a guest authorship, honorary, courtesy, or prestige, is defined as granting authorship out of appreciation or respect for an individual, or the belief that the expert standing of the guest will increase the likelihood of publication, credibility, or status of the work. Gift authorship is credit offered from a sense of obligation, tribute, or dependence within the context of an anticipated benefit to an individual who has not contributed to the work. And that's something that I've seen a lot in my career. I know of many colleagues in junior positions who have complained of, for example, a graduate student. This is a true case. She wrote terrific papers for her dissertation, and the papers were co-authored with her two supervisors, also terrific people. When the paper was going out, she noticed that the name of the department chair had been tagged. And she actually complained to the department chair about it. And he was furious. He said that this is the way we do things around here. When, in fact, according to the opinion of the lead author, he had not participated at all in the intellectual part of the study. I would say that that happens to some extent, and it's unfortunate. Ghost authorship, this is what happened to my colleague at the Cochlear Implant Center. The failure to identify as an author someone who made substantial contributions. So it's completely unfair and unethical for someone to request to be added as an author just because he's the department chair or the PI. That cannot be done. However, it's also unethical not to include someone who actually had a major role in developing the study and writing the manuscript. For example, if that person may not care about authorship because he works for a hearing aid company, and he wrote a paper showing that brand XYZ and their new noise reduction algorithm is far superior to any other algorithm in the market today. That person can obtain an advantage if all the authors in the paper are independent academics. A reader will interpret the paper differently if they see the name of, 2 engineers and the chief audiologist at XYZ hearing aid company. So deleting those names from the list of authors is also inappropriate. Ghost authorship. And there are several recent cases involving the pharmaceutical industry. So ghost authorship may range from authors for hire with the understanding that they will not be credited to major contributors not named as an author. So talking about gray areas, one very important part of authorship is what will the order be? Okay, and in the list of authors there are 2 privileged positions, which is first author, and sometimes the senior author has his name go at the end of the paper. And at least at my university, as a senior person, I get as much credit from being senior author as from being first author. Now, with respect to the rest, it's not always easy to determine who should be the first author. To the extent that it's possible, these things should be discussed in advance. If they involve a collaboration outside the lab, it's even more important to do that, with the understanding that things can change over time. And sometimes you don't know at the beginning who will make the major contribution to a given study. And there will be cases when you have disagreements that don't mean necessarily that anyone did anything unethical, but it still leaves people unhappy about their authorship. So the order of authors is a collective decision of the authors or study group. Yeah, that's it's nice when that happens, but it doesn't always. In conjunction with the lead author, co-authors should discuss authorship order at the onset of the project and revise their decision as needed. And hopefully a consensus will be reached, and it is reached in the majority of cases. Okay, so this is what I had to say, but we have some time to discuss your questions and specific examples. What questions or concerns do you have about authorship? What interesting cases would you like to bring up, real or hypothetical?
So I'm just going to chime in. This is a great discussion, and let's just spend a couple of minutes doing this. We're supposed to have a little break now, and the next session starts at 4:30.
Question, real quick. Something I run into, I do a lot of posters or papers for conferences, and maybe inclusive of people that have worked on it in the lab, but then the paper doesn't get written for much later. So how do people handle that? I mean, when someone's sort of contributed to some of the work, but not, by the time you write the paper, it's evolved a bit. Or any thoughts about that?
I mean, that's another one of the gray areas, right? And it may be reasonable in some cases because you want to be as inclusive as possible without giving away credit. But maybe I think it is possible in my mind for somebody to have barely just made enough contributions to be a co-author of the poster, but not necessarily of the more complete paper that comes later on. To some extent, it depends on.
One idea that's worked well for us, and this comes from working at cross-university consortiums where there's a lot of people. We have a form that you fill out. We've all agreed on whether it's a poster or a student presentation or a paper. And if you're proposing a paper, you fill it all out, and order of authorship is one of the things on there. And then it says if this is intended to proceed to a paper, will that change authorship? So we do it all up front, and we all sign it, and it's really been a great. You have the hard discussion is easier before anybody did any work on it.
Yeah, you talked about famous cases. I just wanted to bring up one very important case that came about in neuroscience involving Nikos Lokothetis, where two of his postdocs had collected data and wanted to publish the data once they had left his lab, and they wanted to submit it, and they did without his knowledge. He did not want to publish the paper. He did not agree with their interpretation of the data. It actually did undergo peer review, and it did get published, but the editors actually had to write an editorial defending their decision because they knew that he was not in agreement with publication of the paper. But I think this is a good demonstration of these things are not so straightforward all the time. The editors claimed that because it was peer-reviewed, the reviewers agreed with the findings of the paper that it should be published, but I'm sure they're not talking now, the previous postdocs and Lokothetis.
Yeah, I don't know, and I wonder whether people have any input about this. There's a question about data ownership in that case. Does the data belong to the postdocs or to the PI or to the institution? Any comments about that? I would go with the institution and the PI over the postdocs.
Your institution probably has rules about this, and in my institution, the institution owns the data, not the PI, not the postdocs, except for student data. So if it was something produced by a student for like a class or something, the student actually owns it, but that may be unique to Arizona.
I think often when data are collected in a laboratory, the laboratory itself is an intellectual property. It's not just that you have this EEG machine with amplifiers and a bit of software. There's always customized software. There's always, or eye tracker or anything like that. And the setup of the laboratory involves some intellectual property. So these postdocs to have collected, data in a laboratory that really wasn't theirs and then not acknowledge what the PI had contributed to the setup of the lab. It's really pretty problematic, yeah.
So we need to go to our break, but I want to finish this by saying something. I only talked about abuse by more senior authors who inject their name in a list of authors without justification. The opposite can also happen. It can be quite common for an inexperienced student or postdoc to say, but wait a minute, I did everything, without realizing that maybe this is an experiment that was already planned and designed before they even got involved in the study. So it's possible to make mistakes in both directions. And one way to try to address these things is to do it at the earliest possible time and with an open discussion among all potential authors.
Thank you very much.